the mind-brain relationship. Introduction. Many are yet to believe that our thoughts and actions are the result of the physical processes in the brain. There is a relationship between our mind and our brain. Our conscious mind controls our behaviors, while our actions is governed by a series of chemical processes in the brain. This study session teaches that most behaviors of animals and human beings are responses to neuronal changes and activities in the brain. In other words, what we do are practical reflections of the responses of the brain to incoming stimulus. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Describe the relationship between the mind and the brain, and 2. Highlight experimental evidences to relate the mind to the brain and vice versa. Experimental evidences relating the mind to the brain. The mind could be said to be product of brain activities. It is, however, difficult to affirm that the mind is controlled by neural processes in the brain. However, there is incontrovertible evidence that various kinds of brain damage lead to specific changes in behavior and losses of sensory capacity. With this, it could be inferred that brain damage could lead to mind damage. Evidences from electrical stimulation of the brain also support behavioral effects of electrical stimulation of the brain. Control of behavior by electrical stimulation of the brain. Fritz and Hitzig, 1870, reported that mild electrical stimulation of portions of the cerebral cortex of a dog could cause muscle movements. At low intensities, the electrical current stimulated discrete, limited movements, especially on the side of the body opposite stimulation. Based on the specific point stimulated, the dog would move its neck, back, abdomen, tail, leg, or some other part of its body. They also found that continuous stimulation of the same point consistently elicited the same response. The result of the experiment was validated in experiments performed in many other species. The above experiment explains that electrical activity occurs naturally in the brain at all times. This electrical activity is caused by nerves sending messages from these sense organs. Their impulses combine with electrical activity already present in the other areas of the brain to produce activity in other areas, which then activates still other areas. In furtherance of this study, Fritz and Hitzig demonstrated that some activity in specific areas of the brain controls specific patterns of movement. Electrical stimulation of more complex behaviors. Von Holst and von St. Paul, 1960, also found that electrical stimulation of the brain can evoke not only simple muscle movements but also more complex sequence of behavior, particularly if the animal is awake during the stimulation and free to move. Working with chickens, von Holst and von St. Paul, 1960, implanted electrodes on the skull of chickens to hold them in place. These electrodes were connected to wires through which weak electrical current was passed to the brain of the chickens while the animal was alive, awake and moving about. The psychological physiologists found that stimulation of various areas of the brain elicited such behaviors as feeding, drinking, grooming, turning the body to one side, sleeping, sitting, escape flight, and aggressive attack. The behavior elicited depended on the exact location of the electrode and the intensity of the stimulation. Stronger currents could stimulate more cells. The elicited behavior also varied depending on the environmental stimuli. For instance, in later experiments with rats, stimulation of certain areas led to eating if only food was present. Celestin Cox Kakolowski, 1970. Similarly, Hess, 1944, found that electrical stimulation of certain areas could induce an animal to fall asleep suddenly. Jose Delgado, 1967, introduces some technological advances that permitted him to investigate the electrical stimulation of a wider variety of behaviors. He advanced the experiment of von Holst and von St. Paul, 1960, by attaching permanent electrodes connected to a monkey's skull via an electrical stimulator. He found that stimulation of some points produced normal coordinated walking, walking in circles, running, falling asleep, cessation of spontaneous movement, or loss of appetite. Also, following a 5-second stimulation of the subcortical areas, there was a stereotyped behavior lasting 10 to 14 seconds. In the experiment, the monkey changed its facial expression, turned its head to the right side, stood up on 2 feet, circled to the right, walked on 2 feet to a pole in the center of the room, climbed the pole, and then came down, growled, threatened, and sometimes attacked another monkey, and finally approached the group in a friendly manner, and then resumed normal behavior. For as many as 20,000 times that this stimulation was repeated, the monkey repeated the behavior responses 20,000 times. Delgado also performed another experiment in 1963 to test aggression among monkeys. Electrical stimulation of the human brain. It is unethical to experiment on human brains. However, if ethical guidelines are followed, there are a few of medical purposes that permit the experimental observation of electrical stimulation of human brains, especially following animal trials. Electrical stimulation has most often been used with humans in an attempt to treat epilepsy, a syndrome caused by abnormal electrical discharge in the brain. The abnormal activity originates in a damaged or malfunctioning area of the brain called the focus of epilepsy. The focus is located in different places for different individuals. The abnormal discharge spreads outward from the focus until a large portion of the cerebral cortex is involved, probably causing uncontrollable body jerks. Surgical excisions may be required, especially when drug treatment fails. Only the part to be incised is anesthetized, leaving the patient conscious in the process. The first step is to discover the focus. In order to do this, the surgeon exposes part of the brain and then applies an electrode to stimulate a few areas in the cortex, one after the other. Eventually, as the surgeon stimulates a point, the patient says, "That makes me feel the same way I feel when I'm about to have one of my seizures." This point can be identified as the focus of the epilepsy. The surgical procedure is then advanced and the focus removed surgically, leading to a cessation of epileptic seizures in the patient. The surgeon can also observe the reaction of the patient to the stimulation of other areas before finally succeeding in identifying the focus of epilepsy. Since electrical stimulation of the brain can elicit not only sensations and movements, but also emotional change, it appears that the activity of the brain is responsible for what we call the mind, since the result of brain stimulation provides an evidence for this conclusion. Study session summary. In this study session, we have noted the following. 1. The mind is just another way of saying brain activities. Despite existing ambiguities, the mind could be observed like a physical entity, separate from the body. This is why it is possible to observe the mind of other people. Number 2. Evidences abound that various kinds of brain damage lead to specific changes in behavior and losses of sensory capacity. Brain damage may therefore relate to mind damage. Number 3. Evidences arising from the study of the behavioral effects of electrical stimulation of the brain also support this viewpoint. Number 4. One of each evidences is the experiment performed in 1870 by Fritz and Hitzig, where they found that mild, non-destructive electrical stimulation of portions of the cerebral cortex of a dog could cause muscle movement. With this, it was found that behavior could be controlled by electrical stimulation of the brain. Jose Delgado, in 1969, introduces some technological advances that permitted him to investigate the electrical stimulation of a wider variety of behaviors. He finds that stimulation of some points produced normal coordinated walking, walking in circles, running, falling asleep, cessation of spontaneous movement, or loss of appetite. And lastly, electrical stimulation of the brain can elicit not only sensations and movements, but also emotional change. It appears that the activity of the brain is responsible for what we call the mind. End of study session 2. Thanks for listening.